Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Women in Sustainable Finance. For those who don't know me, my name is Ren Niemann. I'm a partner in Norton Rose's projects team, and I'm your host for today's webinar. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land where I'm based today, the Jagera and Turrbal Nations, people of the country north and south of the Brisbane River, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Today's WISF event is hosted by CEFC and Norton Rose, and we're asking, what will it take to decarbonise the transport sector? By way of very brief background, Norton Rose is thrilled to be co-hosting today with CEFC. We are one of Australia's leading law firms advising on key infrastructure and technology projects that will lead the way to decarbonising the Australian economy. Some of our recent projects that our leading teams have advised on include advising on the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, encompassing industrial scale green hydrogen project, advising on the Victoria Big Battery project for Neoen, and several industrial scale solar, wind and hybrid projects across Australia, including recent PPAs with operators of transport infrastructure such as airports and roads. Now, as a sector that remains heavily reliant on fossil fuels, the transport sector is on a journey to deliver change across all facets, whether it's public transport, freight or passenger transport. And in that process, it focuses on using technology to help deliver those outcomes. That said, there are many challenges and opportunities in the transport sector to achieve decarbonisation. To help us map these, I'm joined by a panel of three industry experts. Just to briefly introduce them, I have Julia Hinwood, Head of Economic Infrastructure at CEFC, Renata Berglas, CEO of the Queensland Transport and Logistics Council, and Dr. Alina Dini, CEO and founder of Whirl. Today's session will run for about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. You can ask questions at any time using that Q&A box down the bottom of your screen. We'll try and answer as many as we can in the time that we have. We've allowed some time towards the back end of the formal panel discussion. And at the end of the webinar, a questionnaire will appear, and we'd welcome your feedback and identifying anything that in the future WISF can provide webinars on. So on that note, let's get started. So there's a few themes that I want to cover off with our panel today. The first one is just getting a sense of what is decarbonisation of transport. Julie, I might turn to you firstly. Your work at the CEFC in infrastructure touches on all areas of the transport sector. What do we mean when we talk about decarbonising transport?
Thanks, Ren. Yeah, it's a broad topic, and it covers every state in the country and numerous stakeholders as well. So transport generally, freight, ports, airports and passenger transportation are the sectors that I'm looking at. And I'm looking across these assets, the ways in which the CEFC can effectively drive changes to reduce their carbon footprint and enable emission reduction for their users. Why am I looking at that sector? Australia's transport emissions make up 21% of total emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in Australia, and they were projected to be, that's sort of the 2020 number, to be 6% in 2020 above the previous years. So they're growing, and they're growing at the fastest rate of any emissions sector in the economy. The composition of that 20% of Australia's emissions is approximately 60% from cars and light commercial vehicles. And then in the other 40%, you have trucks making up 21%, domestic aviation 9%, railways 4%, buses 3%, and shipping 2%, domestic shipping that is. So you can sort of see this target sectors out of that if you're looking at cars and light commercial vehicles being a really large sector, and then the trucks, which are mostly for freight and logistics purposes, transporting goods around the country. They're the other sort of really big sector out of that. And then you've got sort of targeted areas like buses, which and public transport. The other part of it is freight volumes are growing very steadily and have been growing fast. So through the years 2018 to 2040, they've been projected to grow by 35%, which is very significant. And if you come back to that truck contribution to emissions, that's a significant driver of the growth. So I think that's sort of crystallised why we're looking at transport for me. But the difficulty in sort of delving into the various sectors comes about when you sort of think, how can we target it? How can CEFC use their investment to enable mode switching, say of passenger and freight to rail over road, fuel switching, use of low emissions technology, and use of renewable energy. So they're the ways I've been focusing on it. It's sort of broad brush. It's at the heavy economic infrastructure side of it. What can the actual infrastructure do to enable this switch as well? Because the infrastructure, as well as the vehicles, plays an enormous role in bringing about this change. I think with that, that's sort of just to set the scene. I'll pass over to Alina because she's better placed to talk about passenger electric vehicles.
Thanks, Julia. I would say that the passenger transport sector is the greatest area of opportunity for emissions reductions from the transport sector. And the reason for that is that nearly every single person has either been in or driven a car. And cars often are considered an asset that is owned by an individual, but they can actually unlock an opportunity to decarbonizing the sector and opening up opportunities to combine transport with the energy sector. Electric vehicles present that opportunity best. And it's the thing that's always made me excited most about working about electric vehicles. So when we look at the opportunity for the passenger vehicle sector to become decarbonized, electric vehicles are a fantastic opportunity. In Australia, more than 500,000 new car buyers are interested in an electric vehicle, but only 6,700 have bought in the last year. And what we understand to be the problem is that Australia lacks diversity of product and information about electric vehicles. So bringing people to the table to understand better what the technology can offer, how it can be partnered with decarbonized fuels, such as renewable energy, and shifting the conversation from what has happened in the past to what opportunities exist in the future is a really great way for us to decarbonize passenger transport.
Thanks, Alina. And Renata, where does the Queensland Transport and Logistics Council fit into this transition piece into lower emission transport?
Oh, right. So the Queensland Transport and Logistics Council, we're like an independent industry body resourced through the government to work with the freight sector about their supply chain issues. We take a whole of logistics supply chain approach, and I primarily focus on road and rail and ports, but also there's a sea and air connection there as well, although they tend to be a little bit more federally focused. Queensland Transport and Logistics being very Queensland focused. My role is really in facilitating the collaborative effort between competing interests often and identifying what the opportunities are, where the market failures might be, what the policy issues might be, and how we could shape up the conversation to drive change. And I think throughout this process, especially this year in particular, I've noticed that, we started out with bushfires, we've ended up with COVID, and there's this really groundswell of change in the way that conversations are happening now around sustainability. I feel less nervous about even using the word, I'd have to say, and there's a lot more people that are really interested in seeing change and driving change. And it's really great to see this group of people come together. And Alina, I know you're like myself and you're working as a sole operator in your own little environment, and there's a lot of us working in this environment, consultants and all sorts of people, the people that I've been working with through a hydrogen industry cluster that we're starting to develop. And everyone's got that same energy towards things have to change, we have to do things differently. And I think this is coming to the freight sector as well. I've certainly been working with them slowly over a long period of time to try and see where the opportunities might lie. And I'm very lucky to have an extremely supportive board that are slowly coming to the idea that this vision around assisting the transport sector to transition to a zero emissions future is a good spot for the QTLC to sit in, because I'm not required to push, I'm not a lobby group, I'm not required to push any particular agenda, and we're looking out across the whole freight and logistics sector for which this is going to impact. But the trucking sector, it's a very difficult proposal. If you look at trucks in particular, you're looking at very small businesses. The majority, well over 70%, are just one truck owning operators, and they might be working for or subcontracting to the bigger end of town, which is more like just about 20% of the workload. But it's really difficult for them to actually take a step back, even look at their business from a business angle, and then think about what decarbonisation might look like for that. And then when you look at the big end of town, you're thinking about, there's very, very tight margins. There's a lot of anxiety about, what that transition might mean. There's a lot of inertia towards the diesel that they're reliant on, and the simple processes for which they've already established, the safety requirements and the rest of it. And they're thinking, well, if I buy one of these new hydrogen vehicles or an electric vehicle or whatever it might be, who do I sell it to afterwards? How long is it going to last? What's its maintenance going to be? How do I actually accommodate that within my fleet? There's an awful lot of risk involved and an awful lot of expense to be the first mover. And Australia being quite a small market in a sense, it's without that compelling driver of the government policy sort of angle. I think it's a really interesting place to be, and it's an evolving space, but I think it's really starting to change.
That's a good segue, I think, to start identifying some of the challenges of decarbonising the transport sector. Julie, I might get your thoughts on that, and particularly around technology and financing for the transition. Where do you see some of those challenges arising?
There's a significant part of it has been touched on by Renata. So there's a whole change in mindset and in operations, and then there's an infrastructure piece that's also needed, as well as a change to fleet. So you've got a lot of pieces that have to come together, and that can be pretty daunting for a participant, whether you're at the small end with limited capacity to make those changes, or at the large end working on tight margins. For example, with battery electric buses, we have the technology to do that. It exists, and there are electric bus fleet or buses being rolled out in various states across the country. But with each of those, none of them are yet on a really large scale. There's announcements about large scale change of fleet, such as the Transport for New South Wales program, which has set a target to decarbonise its entire fleet of 8,000 buses over a period of time. But what needs to happen for that is every depot needs to change. The operations within that depot need to change. You need to put the charging infrastructure in place. You need to have a period of transition where you're moving a fleet, because you can't change a fleet overnight. And you also need to retrain people, because you're going from a mechanical operation to an electric operation, and that's quite a different thing to be managing. It's not saying the cost would necessarily be higher. Mostly for a bus fleet, it's likely to be a much lower operating cost and more predictable than dealing with diesel price. But there is that transition to undergo, and that's intimidating for workforce. It's also intimidating for financiers. So what we've found, again, looking at the buses, for example, if you're normally financing a bus fleet, banks do that with asset finance, or the owner of the fleet or operator of the fleet might do it through their corporate finance facilities. But neither of those structures quite work when you've got to put some infrastructure in. Maybe in the case of New South Wales, it's at a depot where the operator doesn't own the depot, doesn't own the buses, and has control over those for a period of time under an arrangement with the state. So it's sort of putting bits of infrastructure maybe into someone else's depot, and how do you finance that and be comfortable around that if that's your security for that transaction. And then tied in with that, new buses, electric buses, people don't understand the residual value of those. They don't know, the battery replacement cycle. Some financiers have that I've spoken to have mentioned issues around battery life being different to the bus life, and how do you get comfortable with that? Who's responsible for changing that battery over? How's that CapEx put into the general sort of operations going forward? So there's quite a number of challenges, and the same things sort of come through when you start looking at heavy vehicles, although the technology is behind in the heavy vehicle sector. So for trucks, there are certainly examples of both battery electric heavy trucks and also hydrogen trucks. The upfront CapEx for them is different. If it's hydrogen, you're going to need a fueling infrastructure. So you come up with the same sort of issues. So it involves a change in mindset, and that change in mindset sort of trickles down to everything in terms of how you finance it and how you operate and run them. So there's quite a bit in that. And then you have the regulatory side as well. So is the regulatory regime favouring or not favouring that technology, that transition? Are there costs that are legacy costs from a different system that might not work? I think, you might have sort of, and everyone always brings up with freight the differential in how the charging works. With rail freight, you pay for the infrastructure essentially as the freight operator. With road freight, you don't. There are charges, but you're not paying for construction of the road typically, because the road's already been built and exists for other users as well as the rail, whereas with rail, it's just existing for those users. So there's those kind of things, fuel excise, different taxes. And there's different ways you can actually pull those together to enable uptake, or you can leave some of those things in place and they can be barriers to uptake.
And can I just ask a very quick question on that? Do you see CEFC's role as trying to help bridge the gap between your traditional financial products, your traditional asset financing, and what might be needed in the future?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So what we are trying to do with a few of these sectors is to come up with structures that commercial lenders will ultimately be happy with once they've seen it deployed and working, and get a sense of that it can be. You want something that's a scalable solution that can be applied across technologies. We certainly wouldn't want to be financing every single new electric bus in the country. We couldn't do that. We wouldn't have enough funds for that. And that wouldn't sort of embrace our mandate, which is to sort of crowd in other funding. So by sort of coming up with structures that are maybe hybrids or variations of the existing structures, that's one way that we would go about doing that, and then be trying to put something in place that, coming from a commercial lending background, I'd be happy to do if I was still in the commercial banking sector where I came from.
So, Alina, it sounds like Julia's got the money all wrapped up. You mentioned earlier there's a lack of diversity of product, which has been a bit of an influence of EV uptake in Australia. Has there been anything else that's really driven the way in which Australia has probably not kept up to pace with the rest of the globe in EV uptake?
Yes. To the point made earlier, lack of diversity means that consumers don't have choice. And when consumers are buying cars once every 10 years, there's a very small window in which you can impact a difference in terms of decarbonizing the way that they move. So one is to displace their privately owned vehicle with a cleaner option. Another is to encourage them to use another mode of transport, for example, like public transport or personal motoring, like a bicycle. But in addition to the lack of diversity for product, another problem that Australians encounter in the passenger transport sector is high cost for these alternatives. And the high cost happens to be a product of generally absence of policy decision. Now, it's not to say that Australia doesn't have quite a bit of policy across the states and territories, and even at some level federally, around electric vehicles. But relative to what's happening overseas in countries like Norway, the United States, and even New Zealand, the level of government support provided overseas is far greater than what we have seen in Australia. And while that's important for consumer mentality around taking on the risk of a new technology, like Julia has referred to with respect to the buses, the more important thing is the signal that it makes to the marketplace globally. What it says, the absence of policy in Australia to providers of products overseas, because as you know, Australia is now a 100% importer of passenger vehicles. What it says is that Australia isn't necessarily as open as other markets to these new technologies. So the products that we get are either at a slightly higher price point than they might be overseas, or the stock is limited. And so as a result of that, the market is quite constrained. And to date, we don't have a really good tool to assess the demand in the Australian marketplace. So I mentioned earlier a survey of 500,000 Australians saying they want an electric car, but I want a Ferrari. That doesn't necessarily mean I have the capacity to buy one. So being able to gauge what the consumer level of interest is, when it's likely that those consumers will put their finger down on the go button and make the shift to a new product like an electric vehicle or another form of sustainable transport option, because there are others, it's still uncertain. And so that's why I've founded Whirl. So Whirl is a company that is designed to revolutionize the way people shop for clean vehicles, specifically electric vehicles. And what's different about Whirl is it helps customers through their shopping experience, because these new technologies are complicated. Buying a car in general is complicated, but buying one with a new type of onboard technology and one that requires a refueling structure that is different to what people are familiar with is a lot to wrap your head around. And consumers need support so that they can make decisions confidently and put that large sum of money that they spend every 10 years to buy a car, because 1 million Australians buy a new car every year. So to ensure that their personal investment in their motoring needs is met when they make a purchase is actually a lot to take on. So what we do is we partner with those shoppers through their shopping process, specifically pairing them with experts who can provide them advice from their empirical work and offer them a convenient test drive, because getting into a new product or being able to try it firsthand is actually the most important part of the buying experience.
Thanks, Alina. Now, Renata, I might ask you a two-part question if I can. We've already sort of touched upon some of the barriers, but I just want to get your thoughts on two things. Firstly, from a sector point of view, is there some resistance coming from operators, or is it they want to transition but are hitting barriers? And if it's the latter, what are some of the key sort of policy changes that we can implement to encourage this transition and drive it more across Australia and particularly in Queensland?
Look, that's a really good question. It really is. And I think it's not resistance that I hear. It's probably, might seem a little unfair, but it's more indifference, I'd say. Yes, if you're the publicly listed type company and you have a requirement for a sustainability plan and reporting on your sustainability efforts, then yes, you're definitely looking into it, but you're looking into things that you can actually achieve, like putting solar panels on all of your warehouses, reducing your electricity content. If you look at Woolworths and Coles, that's the sort of thing that they've been doing in a lot of other big companies. If you're a port, the ports have actually been extremely progressive in this space, I suppose, partly because they've had sustainability as a mandate for quite a long period of time. They've got that community base where they're interacting directly with the community. They've got, the waterway and the edge of the water and how that interfaces. So they've been working on a lot of those sort of processes, and their thinking seems to be sort of progressing slightly faster, because the longer that they've done, the smaller things that they can achieve, the more that they're heading towards their sort of bigger targets. And I think if you look at where, say, hydrogen is being adopted globally, there seems to be a lot of hubs happening at ports. And I'm just guessing, but I'm thinking that this is happening because they've been working in this space for quite a long time, and they're now starting to think about, okay, so I've put all the solar panels in, and then what's my next use of power, and then how I'm going to utilise that energy for something that builds for my tenants and builds for my port community more generally, and financial outcomes are growing around that port space. But then when you look at, say, the other end of town, say I'm looking at a small to medium operator, I think they're kind of waiting for somebody else to make those decisions. Yes, they're well aware that, at some point in time someone's going to force them into doing something about climate change and their zero emissions future, but are they there yet? I don't think so. But are they against it? I don't think so either. I think that for all the barriers that we were talking about, from infrastructure to financial structures to the way you maintain a vehicle to all of those components, they're pretty large hurdles to get across. And even when you look at large-scale infrastructure projects, so I was thinking about the Brisbane City Council Metro project. When it was initially announced in about 2016, I think, it's basically a network. Sorry for those that don't live in Brisbane. It's a network, inner city network, to connect the bus system so that you've got more frequent buses that are running every 3 minutes, and then the rest of the network connects into it, and it just keeps running as a sort of a loop. That's a broad scale idea of what it was or how it works. But their initial project was all focused on diesel buses. No one considered in 2016 that they might go to electric. And I'm not quite sure where they made that decision and how that changed, but it wasn't until late 2019 that they finally decided that they'd go for an electric bus. And that surprises me, because I think if you're going to spend $1.2 billion on an infrastructure upgrade, you'd want to be building for the future, and the future is surely not diesel. So I think these considerations are now starting to come into play, but all of the barriers for which people have mentioned beforehand, including the sort of low level of policy support and the lack of push, means that it's really hard for the small operators and for everybody in between, even for the large scale.
Just to take that point a bit further, Julia, perhaps you might have some insights into some of the clever initiatives that you're seeing businesses either implement or at least explore. Care to give your thoughts on those?
Sure. So we're looking across the spectrum, as I've mentioned before. So our investments have spanned a range of things. We've got an investment in JetCharge, which is a EV passenger EV charging infrastructure installer. We also have an equity investment in Zuma, which is an e-bike company that provides e-bikes largely for the delivery economy, which is a fast-growing sector, and it's that last mile of delivery. So if you can decarbonise that last mile of delivery, it has a huge impact, for food, Uber sort of deliveries. And then at the other end of the spectrum, our investment in, say, the Cube Moorebank Logistics Park, there's an enormous amount of innovation in that facility that's taken place, and that's taken place through the whole design of it. Its initial sort of premise is to provide a sort of rail route from port through to the logistics park, which can then in turn access the inland rail as well. So you can have a sort of rail handling of freight cargo from port out to the logistics park rather than using trucks going through Sydney. But it's an enormous site, and the sort of innovations they've put came from the ground up in terms of recycling materials on site, so reducing embodied emissions through the construction process, using spoil materials from nearby road tunnelling as well for their site foundations, and also the design of warehousing, making the design of those warehouses much more energy efficient so that you reduce the energy requirement overall at the park. And then, installing renewable generation and automating the handling of the freight and logistics at site. So you've actually an electrification of that automated handling, so that you've got a sort of fully, to Renata's point, a fully sort of future-proofed infrastructure that's ready for a decarbonised a decarbonised sector, and all of those things add up to an enormous amount of enabling infrastructure that can then help reduce transport emissions, because you've got the significant piece of taking the trucks off the road in the first place, and then you've got all these other sort of parts along the way. Another example with Inland Rail and some of the projects being done around that could reduce, if you have dedicated freight rail lines, you reduce the delays. For example, coming into Sydney, freight gets held up by curfews so that they can't use, because they share the lines with the passenger trains. The freight comes second to passenger trains, so that the freight trains can get backed up at peak times, sometimes for as much as 4 hours. So if you've got significant diesel engines running for those periods of times, that's a lot of emissions that you don't need to have through a very simple kind of efficiency change to the network. But to do that, you really need enabling infrastructure, being the dedicated freight rail line. So there's a lot. Probably the part that makes it hard is the upfront capex. But there's a lot of things you can do around that. I think we've also seen, we did a report, we engaged AECOM to look at airports and see what airports could do to transition to low emissions, and we got them to review best practices globally across airports to see where the large pieces of energy usage are, and also to see where the largest savings can come from. And that provides sort of case studies. There's a number of examples there. The baggage handling facilities at airports are large energy users, and often they're old systems that have just been built onto over time as capacities expanded, rather than being redesigned from the ground up, because that involves interruption to operations and higher upfront capex. But where you've seen sort of new baggage systems put in place that work on a just-in-time basis rather than a continuous operation basis, again, you see significant energy usage reductions. So it's really coming to it with a mindset for innovation, but a lot of it can be process related, as well as actually changing the technology that you're using.
Thanks, Julia. That was very insightful, and I think I want to sort of draw some threads from that into a question to Alina, and I've seen we're getting some great questions from our audience as well, so we'll get to those very shortly. But Alina, if I can just take a point that Julia just mentioned, we're starting to see a bit of uptake, obviously with EVs, and that's forecast to have a sort of a steady growth rate, even though we're sort of slightly out of whack with the globe more generally. What do you think can be done to overcome some of the barriers to the EV uptake? And do you think this should be more government regulatory led to design more clean energy solutions which drive changes in behaviour, or do you think this should be industry led, through its muscle effectively on research and innovation and its capability? So where do you think those barriers can be overcome, and how do you think that's going to arise?
Thanks, Ren. Your question reminds me of a thread I've seen a lot in the last couple of days, given in the US there has just been a change in the presidency, or there hopefully will be a change in the presidency. And the question that I've seen asked a lot amongst industry professionals in this space online is, will President-elect Biden encourage the Morrison government to shift its thinking around policy for climate? And I've seen varied responses to this question, but what I would say in response to what you've asked around barriers is that the tone of the discussion is really shaped by leadership and what comes from the top. And although Australia has a great deal of excellent examples of companies and investments or developments that have occurred across the transport sector to decarbonize, what's missing for me in relation to the greatest barrier in the transport sector is decisive action around CO2 emissions or tailpipe emissions for passenger vehicles. So Australia is the only country in the OECD that doesn't have a regulation to say that a certain amount of CO2 coming from a tailpipe minimum threshold must be met. And as a result of that, what we are seeing now, given that Australia is largely an importer industry, is that a lot of the cars coming into Australia are not as efficient as they could be. Europe's a great example for where we have seen those regulations encourage industry to behave in a way that provides a better climate-friendly solution in terms of the product they offer. So to the extent the leadership can demonstrate confidence in new technologies and that there is a strategic approach to encouraging that behavior, I think we'll see the consumer mindset shift, as well as the industry mindset shift with respect to providing more of those products. So I would argue that leadership piece is really important. The other thing I'll add around barriers to adoption, specifically of electric vehicles, is a need for sectors to work together. So as we lay the foundation for what the future looks like in Australia, quite a lot of work has been done around economic analyses and understanding how the population is motivated to make decisions. And as a result of that analysis, projects have been undertaken. So for example, Julia mentioned the CEFC's investment in charging infrastructure. We know that in the last year, electric vehicle charging infrastructure as a market has grown by 40%. So there are now, I think it's nearly 2,500 chargers available in Australia, almost 10% the number of cars. So we know that these solutions are slowly improving, but the more that we start to think about the problem as an ecosystem or as not specifically related to a single sector, but related to a climate or sustainability outcome, and work together to achieve a more integrated economy, I think more likely the everyday end users who buy passenger cars are going to also shift their thinking.
Thanks, Alina. And Renata, as an industry body, I mean, you must be looking at how you can spread the awareness and understanding of low emissions transport options, certainly across Queensland and other industry bodies across Australia. Where do you think our investment should be in terms of time and money spent to get the best results when it comes to decarbonisation?
Oh, I think that Alina raised some really good points there around the ecosystem and building the whole ecosystem around decarbonisation and the whole structure around that. At the moment, I'm currently working on a lot of policies around hydrogen industry development, mainly because there's a lot of opportunity there for the freight sector for both road and rail and sea. There's a lot of technology that we could be utilising in Australia that we're not. And a great deal of push from both the federal and the state government towards hydrogen as an industry. So luckily in the last Queensland election, we now have a Minister for Hydrogen and Renewable Energy in Queensland, which is fantastic. And we also know from the technology roadmap, from the federal government's technology roadmap, that hydrogen is definitely a big industry for them. From the federal government perspective, I feel that they're pushing specifically for an export-focused industry, which really suits the way that Australia's generally tended to do business, dig it out of the ground, put it on a boat, or whatever we're going to do. And I think the piece that's really missing, and the piece that QTLC is particularly focused on, is the demand side. What's the domestic demand? How do we grow that? And there's a great example from California between a government and industry partnership approach to this issue around the clean air policy that they brought into place for their ports. Again, I'm back to ports, but ports, all trucks leaving in and out of that port, Los Angeles, because it was such a major port and the emissions were so great coming out of it, they brought in a clean air policy, and then they were working for roughly, and it takes a long time for this change to come through, around 20 years they've been working with the industry on how that transition might occur and what sort of steps are going to be taken. And gradually, hand in hand between the actual stated policy about how many emissions each truck could produce through to cut-off points for diesel vehicles, and the whole process working with industry has been hugely valuable in terms of transitioning the industry in a way that makes financial sense for them. They can see what the future pathway is, and it's clear what the outcome is that everyone's driving towards. And I think Julie raised this before, it's a significant capex, and how do you actually drive that change and build it into your financial modelling and your future process? And part of that actually is, the policy settings that are around that. So from my perspective in Queensland, hydrogen looks like a great new energy to talk about with industry. I'm working on getting up demand-side projects, setting up working groups with industry players to find out, where do they want to use it? What are the low-hanging fruit? Do they want to move towards forklifts? As Julie mentioned, the intermodal hubs are a really good and dynamic space to be working with, because not only have you got warehouse capacity, but you've also got trucks and trains all interrelating in one space. So if you set up the infrastructure there for refuelling or even the supply of hydrogen in that facility, you've got a great opportunity for using and centralising the demand. I also think hydrogen is going to be a great disruptor, because it's not a centralised fuel distribution network in the way that we've had before. It could be regionally produced. We could interconnect all of the hubs that we're already establishing. So in Queensland, we're establishing sort of a hub in Gladstone. There's projects going on in Townsville. There's other projects going on in regional areas. And then how do you bring that interrelated picture together, or as Alina was talking, the ecosystem together, such that you've got a viable freight network as well that connects all of those points, and what's the domestic demand and drive. So I suppose that's what I've been focusing on at the moment and getting quite a bit of traction, because, it's where I see one opportunity, but it's not the only opportunity. It's just one that has taken me at the moment.
Thanks, Renata. Maybe I can do a quick segue to Julie before we take questions. I mean, in terms of hydrogen and other new technologies such as biofuels, there is a concern that a focus purely on electrification might kill off some of those potential solutions and the opportunities they present. What are you seeing in the market around these solutions, these other solutions, and should we be focusing on a diversity of solutions or some form of single technology that can cure all ills?
I think we need to focus on a diversity of solutions. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. And I think you'll see different pieces fit in for different sectors, and even have the same sector possibly. There's hydrogen fuel cell buses around, and there's also electric battery electric buses around, and both have a place. Same with cars. So I think there'll be different models out there. I think if I put my own personal future view on, I would say you're probably going to be, passenger vehicles in the battery electric space for a lot of it, but maybe for longer distance, you might start leaning to hydrogen once the network's up and running, but you need a network. I think buses are going to be battery electric, because that seems to be the way they're heading from a cost perspective at the moment. Maybe they'll move to hydrogen at some point, but I can see the Australian fleet pretty much moving to electric maybe in the next 10 years. That'd be my sort of stab in the dark on that. And then you've got trains. Well, hydrogen trains are in existence, not very many of them. I think Siemens have a hydrogen passenger train that they're trialling, or that is actually on order, available on order, but there's a huge backlog and not many of them are around. They haven't got to the heavy haulage requirements of a freight locomotive, but they're there for passenger locomotive. Shipping, there's a lot of international sort of changes around the shipping sector and their fuels. It's been largely focused on particulates, but it will probably move on from that as well. And there's there's global agreements in the shipping sector on what they're looking at in that space, and ports are doing things to enable. Some ports are doing things to enable lower emitting ships to come in. So, for example, I think New South Wales Ports has reduced tariffs for more fuel efficient, lower emitting ships coming into port. So there's sort of incentives that can be operated and offered by the private sector as well. Heavy trucks, they're probably a bit further out, but not that far out. Like I see them probably coming maybe 5 to 10 years. You can see the turnover of fleet, but it's sort of hard because you're dealing with across the sector vehicles that have very long life. You know, maybe your locomotives sit around for 30 years, sometimes longer. Buses, trucks, 30 years isn't unusual, but probably 20 years, maybe more, the normal considered asset life. And as Alina mentioned, people turn over their passenger cars every 10 years. So you are looking at a change that will be progressive and be slow, but I think there's a place for all those technologies in there. And I think it all comes back to getting to the right level of demand to make it economic, and it's there for some sectors, and then you've got to have the will, and you've got to also, I think the leadership really helps with that as well, in terms of making people aware of it, making people think it exists and it's viable. We get a lot of negative press in Australia about, are these technologies really real? Do they really work? And yet they're working perfectly fine in places like Norway and California. So I think there's that side of it to look at as well. But yeah, I wouldn't advocate one or the other. I think it comes from all sectors. I mean, the e-bikes, who would have thought we'd all be getting sort of numerous small deliveries doing that last mile on push bikes, but rather than in vans. But because of the volume and because of the traffic, e-bikes really have a place in that sector. And maybe 5 years ago, even, we wouldn't have thought of that. So I think it's evolving. I think there's shared infrastructure opportunities that will come out of it as well, and that'll come around hydrogen, such as those hubs at maybe logistics centres, maybe ports. And then there's also shared, users of vehicles, shared. So some of that shared economy piece will come into it too. But yeah, not one technology, definitely a range.
Thanks for that, Julia. And I'm going to flip over into some of the questions we've been asked now. Thank you very much for sending those through. We've sort of touched on some of the questions already, but perhaps I could start with an easy one to ask and probably a difficult one to answer for the entire panel, in terms of where do we see the impacts of COVID having played out in terms of either sort of stifling or accelerating efforts to decarbonise? And once we get out of the back end of COVID, is there a prioritisation we should focus on in terms of decarbonisation, or is it just let everything run in parallel to try and get to the finish line as quickly as possible? I might start with you, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, that is a hard question. It's a bit of future gazing. I think, if you look at if you look at a sector like the airlines, which have really been hit very, very hard by COVID, I mean, their volumes are down to almost zero. And they were in a good growth trajectory at the start of the year. So they're going to be focused, I think, less on this is my prediction, I would say their focus is going to be on just getting their businesses back up and running and to sustainable volumes. So I think when it's as drastic as it has hit the airlines, you're probably not going to see a lot of action on the decarbonisation side. You might still at airports, but they're obviously impacted by the same sort of effects of COVID. And if you're talking about a 3+ year time frame for international volumes to recover to pre-COVID levels, and at least probably 18 months for domestic volumes, that's a really significant operational issue they've got to overcome as bodies. So their CapEx is going to be constrained. They're really going to be focused on essential things. freight and logistics, I think, and Renata will know more about this, so I'd probably leave it to her to talk about, but I think overall, maybe they've had some interruptions to supply and so on, but people still need things, and people have, goods and services goods have been moving around the country throughout all of COVID. So I think they're probably less impacted, and, there are still the usual concerns around fuel costs and things like that, which can drive some of the change. So I see those sort of, your ports and your freight and logistics operators maybe being less impacted and still focusing on what's required. And I think another interesting piece is the investors in those assets are driving change as well. So, a lot of the industry super funds and the other sort of institutional investors invest in these big infrastructure assets, and they're being driven by different agendas, such as the Task Force for Climate Change related disclosures. So there's a sort of side coming from the investors saying we want to see these assets change, and I don't think that push is abating. I haven't seen that abate through this COVID-19 period, and I think that will continue to drive change with those assets. And then I think the end users, maybe if you're looking again, freight and logistics, there's a big announcement by Woolworths about getting to net zero. That's going to drive who they work with down their supply chain, and that's going to force change across the sector as well. So I don't see those forces lessening through COVID-19.
Renata, maybe I'll flick it over to you, and you can talk a bit about freight and logistics and the impact of COVID and where to from here.
Look, I'd have to agree with everything Julie said, and I think where some things go up and other things go down. So during the COVID, we had such a boom in toilet paper and the rest of it that because a lot of the supermarket products go by rail up the north coast in Queensland, that's their way of travelling from Brisbane to Cairns. So there was a vast amount of product that went onto rail rather than road, and we had no cyclones and no issues with rail. So that was a very big positive, along with actually exactly what you're saying about the investors moving towards a more clean approach and driving that demand. But at the same time, COVID also brought down fuel prices. So, there's also that, why change? Fuel prices are really low. So it's some on one side and some on the other. And you're right, Julie, I don't think that freight and logistics, I think the trucks kept moving, most things kept moving except for the airline industry. But there is a general shift, as I was sort of trying to mention beforehand. I think there really is a change in attitude. I think that change in attitude is really important to driving a change in behaviour, and you can't have one without the other. So, and that has come through the pause that COVID has brought, through the requirement to consider things differently, through different processes that we're now taking on board, even behaviour changes like not paying for your bus ticket and only ever tapping onto the bus, or never hitting the button when you cross the lights. Like, there's all these little behaviour changes that have come into play due to COVID that I think will have subtle and long-lasting impacts. I know that's probably a little bit airy-fairy for where we're going with freight and logistics, but I think it all does add to the bigger picture.
Thanks for that, Renata. And Alina, final point, I mean, in terms of, the Whirl platform, you would have seen a bit of consumer response. Where do you think COVID's impacted, and what do you think that will look like going forward?
What we know for sure about COVID is that it has had a massive economic impact on everyday people. And so as a result of that, people haven't been buying cars or much of anything other than toilet paper and homewares. But what's interesting is that the statistics show that consumers who are buying cars are more interested in sustainable cars, such as electric vehicles, than they are in the traditional conventional options. And I think the reason for that is that COVID has impressed upon all of us the impact of our own individual behavior. So whether it's using hand sanitizer or wearing a mask, or how much your personal motoring impacts the environment, we know that we're now looking at the world through a different lens, because we know that how we behave can impact the people around us. And I think that shift in thinking will be really, really significant in coming years. I'm hopeful that it will be, because it will be what is required of us as a demographic of everyday people to get to those sustainability targets and goals that we have to actually shift the dial around decarbonizing the passenger transport sector. Well,
I can guarantee you this topic today has garnered a lot of interest. The amount of questions I can't keep up with, and I apologise in advance that we're not able to ask and answer all of them. So, but please keep feeding them in, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to you on those. But maybe I can just ask for some very quick closing remarks, and let's get our crystal ball out here and gaze into the future. And perhaps, Julie, I can start with you. Just give us a 1-minute snapshot of what you think the transport sector will be doing to drive decarbonisation.
Okay, so I do see passenger vehicles converting in the next 10 years. I see that being a big shift, and we could look out the window in 10 years and have quite quiet freeways full of electric cars. Because the technology's there, because it's been deployed. Yes, we're slow on it, but it's coming and it's there elsewhere. I think there's still a mind shift, but it's happening, like I said, with the investors on the big infrastructure assets that enable this. So you've got to get the infrastructure right to support the transition if you're going to convert fleets of trucks and fleets of buses and fleets of sort of other heavy sort of transport onto an electric basis or a low carbon basis. So that's going to involve coordination, because there are so many stakeholders to those sectors, and I see that being a bit slower, unfortunately. But the really good story about it is the technology is there. We're seeing electric planes already being trialled. There's 2 Australian companies who have had trials this year of those, and they could be used for short-haul passenger flights, and that's a reality, for regional centres around, Magnix is doing it in Queensland, potentially. That's sort of in their plan. And the larger airlines are looking, the Boeings and Airbuses are looking at hydrogen fueled aircraft, large passenger planes. So there's a real move. The technology is about, and it can happen. So I see really, really material changes in the next 10 years in this sector.
And Renata, where do you think the majority of your members are going to be focused on, and how long do you think it'll take before they're running a fairly green operation?
I think they are, in a large extent, focused, and I agree with Julie. I have a really positive outlook towards this. The change is coming. The technology is there. You never know quite when things will flip from one thing to the other. Where does it get to that critical point where it's actually more difficult to stay the same than it is to make that change? And I don't think that any of us have a crystal ball to see where that will be, as I didn't know that I needed a Nokia phone, let alone an iPhone, to now to whatever. And those things are still significant changes in our lives. So, but I do think they're coming, and I think the globalisation of the world in general, we're seeing this happen. We're seeing Germany invest 9 billion euros, I think it is, in their hydrogen industry. They want to be the leaders in Europe, and Japan's desire for that hydrogen, and the export opportunity there for Australia. Just having that pool, international pool, is going to help us change, I think, because I don't think that we want to see ourselves as being the place where you send all of your old technology to die because Australia still hasn't turned over to a green future. I don't think Australians will tolerate that as a future goal. I think we're really heading towards the opportunity. We've got all the processes are in place, like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We've got NERA, we've got all these bodies trying to energise this change. So, yeah, I think there is a real positive future. And we're also starting to really measure what our emissions are and what that generally means. And we've got financial sectors, Julie pointed out, changing their approach. So, yes, my crystal ball says that things are changing because life is always changing, but also because that's the drive that we're going to see going into the future. But how long it takes, Oh, I'm not going to touch that one. Maybe Alina's got a better idea about, the electric vehicle space.
Yeah, fair enough, Renata. And maybe on that positive note, Alina, lucky last. This question is probably going to take you 3 hours, but I'm going to give you 1 minute. What is the most exciting bit about this for you and the future of transport, particularly passenger transport?
Yeah, thank you. Look, for me, the most exciting thing is what we don't know is coming yet. What Renata's just said about things flipping very quickly. We've had so many cool business models and new technologies come into the passenger transport mix, whether it's Lime scooters or Uber Eats. And as a result of that, who knows what might be around the corner. So while I think we have a pretty good understanding, given all of the research that's been done through organizations like the CEFC, ARENA, and some of the other state-based bodies, what we don't know is what the future will look like. And I think as long as we have an open mind, agile thinking, and we are open to a diversity of options for change, that the future can be whatever we imagine it. So I'm really excited about how the market shapes, given what's happened this year, but also what's possible in the future.
Well, that's a fantastic way to end our seminar. And ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our webinar today. Can I just thank Julia, Renata and Alina for your insights and sharing those with us today. And thank you to the audience for not only joining us, but your great participation. Certainly on behalf of CEFC and Norton Rose Fulbright, we thank you for supporting this WISF online webinar. There will be a quick survey that will come up shortly, so please let us know what you thought of today and things for the future. And we certainly do hope to see you at another WISF event very soon. On that note, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.